Hello, this is the Philosophical Rebellion Substack. Today I'm going to talk about the campus protests, the uncommitted vote in the Democratic primary, and the 2024 presidential election. I do believe that Donald Trump would be terrible for America in a second term, so I prefer Joe Biden. But that does not mean Biden is entitled to my vote. Right now, Joe Biden is personally responsible for the starvation of children, and he has been doing everything he can to facilitate Israeli war crimes. Right now, the Israeli government is exempted from the human rights conditions that are supposed to be applied under current U.S. law to every single nation receiving our aid. Those are called the Leahy laws, and Israel is exempted from the vetting process at the State Department. That way, no matter how many war crimes or crimes against humanity the Israeli government commits, we continue funding them. And not only are we funding them, we are also providing them diplomatic cover at the United Nations by vetoing multiple ceasefire resolutions and, right after the siege, cutting off food, water, medicine, and electricity to civilians was announced by the Israeli government. The Joe Biden administration vetoed a UN resolution condemning all attacks on civilians. Then, after acknowledging the indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, continued to facilitate over 100 weapons transfers to Israel to be used in that indiscriminate bombing. All of that was done in violation of the Leahy laws, but Joe Biden is exempting the Israeli government from Leahy vetting at the State Department. And a State Department determination is necessary to enforce the Leahy law. So the facts of the situation are that the Israeli government on October 9th was reported to have enacted a siege. So they were purposefully cutting off food and water to civilians. That is a violation of one of the Leahy laws called the Foreign Assistance Act, which says that any nation blocking U.S. humanitarian aid from reaching its destination is disqualified from receiving U.S. aid until they stop. And at the end of April, the United States Secretary of State said that 100% of the population of Gaza is facing severe acute food insecurity. The World Food Program has said that this is a mass famine, and that does not mean that people are going hungry. That means the threat of death is imminent because they have been facing severe hunger for so long. This did not come out of nowhere. This is a clear Israeli policy, and organizations like Human Rights Watch have already determined that the Israeli government is engaged in the war crimes of collective punishment and using starvation as a weapon of war against civilians, including children. So let's be very clear about this. Children are starving to death right now because of Joe Biden's policy of unconditional support for Israel with absolutely no red lines whatsoever. And that is the motivation for the uncommitted vote in America. So let's put all the labor issues, abortion, all of that on the side for a second. There are children starving to death right now as a result of the Israeli government using starvation as a weapon of war. And Joe Biden is personally choosing to enable that. Joe Biden is facilitating the starvation of children. And these are the deaths starting to happen from starvation. There have already been 13,000 children killed in the indiscriminate bombing of Gaza. That means for 7 months, over 80 children every single day have been killed. And Joe Biden has been choosing to supply the bombs. And that is so disgusting and morally repugnant that normal people should not be able to support the person facilitating it. The people committing it, the Israeli government leaders, need to be prosecuted and serve time in The Hague for war crimes, probably the rest of their lives, including Netanyahu. But Joe Biden is also involved. So let me be abundantly clear. As a voter, my red line is complicity in the collective punishment and starvation of children. And right now, Joe Biden is complicit in the starvation and collective punishment of children. But instead of helping protect civilians, Joe Biden is doing everything he can to facilitate their collective punishment. So the uncommitted vote has nothing to do with support for Trump or any third-party candidate. This is about Joe Biden's policy towards Israel of unconditional support with no red lines and continued exemption from the Leahy law vetting process at the State Department. And although I would prefer Joe Biden to Donald Trump, I refuse to support Joe Biden by voting for him while he continues his current policy. So I made my point as clear as I possibly could, and I told the Joe Biden administration to direct the State Department to make 4 assessments regarding violations of the Leahy laws, and give the State Department a 30-day review period to issue their assessment on whether or not Israel has committed any war crimes or violations of international law which disqualify them from receiving American aid throughout the prosecution of this war, as well as the pre-war global consensus of the world's leading human rights organizations that Israel was committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. So far, Joe Biden has seemed willing to completely sacrifice his 2024 presidential election campaign in order to enable the starvation of children. Yet, in response to the campus protests, he's quick to condemn them without at all engaging with the actual protesters, who have overwhelmingly been nonviolent. So I agree that things like property damage and actual hate speech that targets people for their identity is wrong. And I guess many people don't know about the Holocaust, but it was the worst human rights atrocity of the 20th century, where 6 million Jews were rounded up, taken to concentration camps against their will, where they were imprisoned until they were eventually executed. They were just normal civilians living their lives that were taken from their homes and murdered. And that was committed by the Nazis. And it was in response to that the State of Israel was even created, as a safe state for Jews to live free from persecution. And that evil Nazi ideology is actually not extinct. There are still people today that support the Nazi movement. There are even billionaires with really close ties to Supreme Court justices that have personal collections of Nazi memorabilia. There are still people today who believe in the ideology of the Nazi movement. So I have no problem condemning the beliefs of anybody who thinks that Jewish people should be persecuted based on their identity. And that is what anti-Semitism is. When I Google it, the definition that comes up is hostility to or prejudice against Jewish people. So I have no problem saying anti-Semitism is wrong. You should not discriminate against Jewish people on the basis of their identity. But criticism of the Israeli government policy of indiscriminate bombing and collective punishment is not anti-Semitic. And despite the fake news and Joe Biden attempting to paint the campus protest movement as anti-Semitic, that is not what's happening. Of course, anytime you have a movement of hundreds of thousands of people, even if it's 99% peaceful, non-violent speech, it is possible to cherry-pick certain instances and mischaracterize the entire movement as the same as those extremists. But the overwhelming majority of these protesters and the overwhelming majority of the uncommitted vote are not anti-Semitic in any way, and it is a deliberate misstating of facts to try to portray them as that. They are protesting against the Israeli government's use of starvation as a weapon of war, against the Israeli government's indiscriminate bombing of a civilian population, against the Israeli government's planned ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So in honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day, I want to ask, what does never again mean? I thought it meant never again will we sit idly by and tolerate a government attacking civilians. I thought never again meant that we would do everything that we could to oppose the mass slaughter of civilians. But there is this Orwellian doublespeak taking over, where never again to the Israeli government means that it is okay for them to indiscriminately bomb civilians, or to withhold food, water, and medicine to 2.3 million people, or to order people in the north of Gaza to go to the south of Gaza and then bomb the north of Gaza into becoming uninhabitable. Then ordering people in the south of Gaza to go to Rafah, and then flattening South Gaza. So now you have 1.7 million displaced Gazans in Rafah. And Biden has told Netanyahu that it is a red line to invade Rafah. But Netanyahu and the Israeli government have already begun their invasion of Rafah. So not just through the planned starvation of a civilian population, but through bombing and shooting those same people, we are standing on the cusp of Israel, leading to the deaths of tens of thousands more, if not hundreds of thousands more people in Gaza. So clearly, when I use the words never again, I have a different meaning than Netanyahu. But the Orwellian doublespeak goes so much further than that, because they have been conflating criticism of the Israeli government and its conduct throughout this war as anti-Semitism. And they have been equating the American public's opposition to our government unconditionally supporting Israel and exempting them from the Leahy law vetting process as anti-Semitic. But it is not. The issue is that they are trying to redefine all of the words that the Palestinians use to advocate for their own freedom as calls to genocide. So with something like intifada, to Palestinians that actually sincerely use the term, I have almost exclusively heard it as a term advocating for the peaceful, nonviolent uprising or revolution or resistance to the Israeli apartheid occupation of Palestine, not as a call for genocide. But in Orwellian doublespeak, it is a call for genocide. Same with the phrase, from the river to the sea. If you listen to the fake news, that is a call to genocide. But that one is even more hypocritical. According to the only Palestinian member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, her direct quote is, "From the river to the sea is an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence, not death, destruction, or hate." But if you listen to the propaganda, they define from the river to the sea as a Palestinian call for genocide, while at the same time defining the Israeli government's stated policy of trying to achieve territorial control from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, combined with the ongoing genocidal war crimes of the Israeli government as self-defense. And that is one thing a United Nations official has already said, that the Israeli government is intentionally distorting the laws of war and words like human shields in order to justify their targeted attacks on civilians. So there's a very important quote to remember. Truth is the first casualty of war. And in this war, the truth has been deliberately suppressed or distorted in order to justify the Israeli government's ongoing war crimes. And if Joe Biden wants to earn back the support of the uncommitted vote who find his policy of unconditional support for war crimes with no red lines so morally repugnant that they refuse to support him through voting for him, then he needs to enforce the Leahy laws, which disqualify the Israeli government from receiving U.S. aid. I want Joe Biden to win. The progressive movement in America delivered him the White House, and in return, he has aligned with Bernie Sanders and become the most pro-labor president in my lifetime. Joe Biden has actually gone and stood with workers during a strike. And from the FTC to the NLRB and all the other federal agencies having to do with economic policy, I think Joe Biden has been doing a good job representing the interests of workers and consumers. Trump, on the other hand, is a lifelong narcissist born into extreme wealth, making $200,000 a year at 3 years old, then becoming a millionaire by 8. So he is an elite and has been since childhood. And when Biden was accused of taking bribes from foreign countries in exchange for policy decisions, Donald Trump and Jared Kushner actually did that with Saudi Arabia. They've received billions of dollars from the Saudis, and in exchange, during the Trump administration, MBS said that he had Jared Kushner in his pocket. And that bought them three main things. When Congress blocked weapons going to the Saudi government during their genocide in Yemen, Trump overturned that block. And when the Saudi government assassinated an American journalist, Trump was quoted saying, "I saved his ass," about MBS. So for bribes, the Saudi government bought weapon sales, support for their war in Yemen, and turning a blind eye to the assassination of an American journalist from Trump and Kushner. Then Donald Trump tried to overturn the 2020 election, and in that attempt, orchestrated a seditious conspiracy to try to challenge the peaceful transfer of power at the Electoral College. I truly hope Joe Biden chooses to listen to his base instead of continue to gamble with the 2024 election in order to facilitate the starvation and collective punishment of civilians, including children. Because already the deaths of 13,000 children should rest heavily on Joe Biden's conscience. So this is not something that's going away. This is not something that people will get over. This is not something you could say, hey, Trump's bad, so I get a free genocide. Vote for me anyway. And no matter how much Joe Biden tells his base to sit down and shut up because he's supporting Israel and would rather give a Republican the White House than enforce human rights conditions, this is not going away.